The daycare. With no children, behind the false wall. An officer brushes her hand against a section of wall in a quiet Colorado basement, and it moves. Not the way a solid wall moves, the way a door moves. Behind it, a staircase going down into a finished room she'd just been told more than once did not exist. And packed into that room, in the dark, some of them crying, most of them under the age of 3, 25 children nobody upstairs had admitted were even in the building. That's where this story ends up. To understand how a routine welfare check turned into that moment, we have to go back to the beginning, to an afternoon that started with nothing more than a knock on a door. On the afternoon of November 13th, 2019, Officer Landon pulled up outside a daycare in El Paso County, Colorado, for what her paperwork called a welfare check. That's it. That's all the call sheet said. Not a standoff, not a hidden wall in a basement, not 25 toddlers who'd been sitting in the dark for who knows how long. Just a welfare check, the kind of routine call an officer might run 3 times in a shift and forget about by dinner. She would not forget about this one. Nobody who worked this case ever did. The daycare was called Play Mountain Place, and from the street it looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. A home-based daycare on a quiet stretch of Willamette Avenue, the kind tens of thousands of parents across the country rely on every single morning. A place where you drop off a diaper bag and a sippy cup and a kid who's still half asleep, and you trust that when you come back at 5, that kid will be fed, safe, and exactly where you left them. That trust is the whole business model of a daycare. It's also, as this case would prove, the easiest thing in the world to exploit. Why police were even there, licensing officials had gotten complaints about the woman who ran Play Mountain Place, a woman named Carla Marie Faith. The complaint was simple on its face. She might be caring for more children than her license allowed. If you're not a parent, that might not sound like much. But daycare capacity limits aren't bureaucratic red tape. They exist because a room full of toddlers needs a specific number of adult eyes on it at all times. Too few adults, too many kids, and you don't have a daycare anymore. You have a room where nobody can promise a 2-year-old won't choke, wander off, or get hurt and go unnoticed for 20 minutes. So capacity alone would have been a serious problem. But the concern that actually pulled a patrol officer to the scene went further than a head count. Licensing officials suspected Carla might be hiding children from them. Say that out loud and it sounds almost too strange to take seriously. Hiding kids at a daycare. But one detail made it impossible to wave off. A mother had confirmed she'd dropped her toddler off that very morning. And when officials reached out to the daycare, they were told, flatly, that there were no children there that day. One parent said her son was inside. The daycare said the building was empty. Somebody was wrong, and when the somebody in question is a business responsible for the safety of babies and toddlers, an officer doesn't get to shrug and move on to the next call. So the entire case, from its very first second, boiled down to one question that should have had the easiest answer in the world. Where was that child? The first 15 minutes Landon arrived alongside licensing officials who'd already been trying, without much luck, to get someone at Play Mountain Place to explain what was going on. They'd knocked, they'd called, they'd gotten nothing that resembled a straight answer. When they walked the property, there wasn't a child in sight, but there was music, kids' music, the sing-songy kind you'd expect in a daycare, drifting from somewhere. And nobody was coming to the door the way people come to the door when they've got nothing to hide. The longer the officials talked, the stranger the picture got. One of them mentioned that a parent had shown up earlier to pick up her child, and that Carla had called her and told her to leave. Sit with that for a second, because it's not a small detail. A daycare owner does not tell a parent to leave when that parent is standing there to collect their own kid. That's backwards. A parent shouldn't have to negotiate their way to their own child. Landon felt the shape of the call start to shift under her. This had walked up as a licensing issue, wrong paperwork, too many kids, and overdue inspection. But standing on that lawn, her question wasn't about paperwork anymore. It was simpler than that, and far more urgent. Are the kids okay? She wasn't there to count cubbies or check a binder of enrollment forms. She was there because a toddler had, according to his own mother, walked into this building that morning, and the building was now telling police it was empty. And if she couldn't account for one missing kid, she had to assume there might be more. A bad feeling with a paper trail. Now, a bad feeling by itself doesn't let an officer kick a door in. Suspicion isn't proof, and Landon knew that. But there's a difference between one odd detail and a pile of them all pointing the same direction. And by this point, the pile was getting hard to ignore. The music nobody would explain. The parent who couldn't get a straight answer. The mother who'd been told to leave mid-pickup. Carla, apparently, coming and going around the property in a way that didn't match nothing to see here. And underneath all of it, one toddler who was supposed to be inside a building that everyone connected to it was suddenly insisting was empty. If Carla was telling the truth, this should have taken 30 seconds to sort out. No kids today. Here's the empty daycare. Look around. See for yourself. Instead, every question Landon asked seemed to get a slightly different, slightly evasive answer than the one before it, and she was about to find the first hard evidence that the children hadn't gone anywhere. They'd just been kept out of view. Where are the kids? A question nobody could answer. In any functioning daycare, this is the easiest question on earth to answer. They're in the playroom. They're outside. They're down for a nap. Ms. Fresquez has them in the yard. You should be able to answer it before you finish being asked. At Play Mountain Place, every version of the answer moved sideways. A licensing official mentioned Carla had been spotted slipping out the back. A car had come and gone. A man named Mark Spain showed up and told Landon he worked for Carla. When she asked him directly where the kids were, his best answer was that he didn't think Carla had any children in her care right then. That answer solved exactly nothing, because Landon already knew, for a fact, that at least one toddler was supposed to be inside that building. A kid too young to explain where he'd gone, too young to walk out and announce he was fine, too young to have any idea the adults responsible for him might be lying to a police officer's face. Landon told Mark plainly what was actually happening. Parents had dropped their kids off, and those kids weren't where they were supposed to be. If he had a child of his own in there, she said, he'd want someone doing exactly what she was doing right now. That's the emotional core of this entire case, and it's worth sitting with before we get anywhere near a basement, before the false wall, before the charges in the courtroom. There were parents going about a completely ordinary Wednesday, dropping their kids off and heading to work, fully trusting the system was going to hold. And now an officer was standing in the driveway of that daycare, trying to figure out whether their kids had been moved, hidden, or left somewhere they shouldn't be. Landon asked Mark not to call Carla and tip her off while officers sorted this out. That request mattered more than it might sound like, because when the adults around a scene are already giving you shifting answers, a warning phone call is exactly how the truth gets buried a little deeper. Then a mother showed up expecting to collect her child, and just like that, the missing kid stopped being a theory in a report. He was a real toddler, and there was a real parent standing on that lawn looking for him. Just a friend. A woman named Chrissy appeared around the property, and when Landon asked who she was, Chrissy said she was just a friend of Carla's, not an employee, just a friend stopping by. At the time, that probably sounded like the least important detail of the whole afternoon. It wasn't. Court records would later show Chrissy, full name Christina Swager, was in fact an employee at the daycare, not some neighbor who happened to be around. And when someone lies to police about their actual role in a scene like this, investigators have every reason to ask what else they might be lying about. Hold on to that detail. It comes back around, and it's a bigger deal than it looks right now. Carla. In person. Then Carla appeared, and she did not carry herself like a woman sitting on a crisis. She was calm, polite even. She offered water. She fielded some questions without much visible strain. But calm isn't the same thing as honest, and Landon knew that better than most. She laid out exactly why police were there. Officers had knocked and gotten no answer. Music was audible from somewhere inside. There were real concerns about the children's welfare, and Carla herself had been seen moving oddly around the property. And she made one thing very clear. She wasn't there as a licensing inspector worried about paperwork violations. In that moment, she didn't care about the technical side of it at all. She cared about the kids, full stop. That should have made things simple. If the kids were at a park, say which park. If another adult had them, name the adult. If they'd been moved to the second house on the property, just say so. None of that happened. Instead, Carla said she'd been out at lunch. She suggested there was nothing here to find, and that the whole thing was being blown out of proportion. The problem was, the facts kept refusing to cooperate with that story. The backpacks. There were 2 separate houses on the property, and Landon wanted to check both. Carla and Chrissy started talking about a tenant, about permission, about reasons an officer might not be able to just walk through. In a normal situation, sure, maybe that's a fair boundary. This was not a normal situation. A toddler had been dropped off. Carla said there were no children present. A parent was standing there trying to pick her kid up. Music was audibly playing. And the 2 women in front of her were acting like Landon's questions were an inconvenience rather than an emergency. She searched what she legally could, room by room, looking for anything that would make the story make sense. At first, nothing. No kids. And somehow that made it worse, not better, because if the evidence kept pointing toward children being nearby and none were visible, somebody had to be actively hiding them. That's when the case got its first real physical break. Not a child yet. Backpacks. A lot of them stuffed under blankets in a shower area where they had absolutely no business being. Backpacks aren't nothing in a daycare. They're not clutter, they're a paper trail with straps. Spare clothes, diapers, bottles, wipes, a stuffed animal, snacks, things a parent packs because they're trusting someone else with their kid for the next 8 hours. When Landon pulled back that blanket and found a pile of children's backpacks hidden underneath it, the whole case tightened like a fist. This wasn't about Carla's word anymore. This was about what the house itself was showing her. These bags weren't hanging by the front door where a parent would grab them at pickup. They were covered up, deliberately. When Landon asked about them, Carla had an answer ready. She was cleaning them for a local soccer team. A soccer team. That might have flown if there'd been 3 or 4 generic gym bags. These were diaper bags. Children's backpacks, unmistakably built for kids too young to play soccer, and there were too many of them to match the story she was offering, especially with a toddler unaccounted for and a mother standing in the driveway. Landon started looking for names, for tags, for anything that could connect a bag to a parent she could actually call. Because here's the thing about Carla's story. It only worked as long as those parents stayed unreachable. If she called the numbers on those bags and every parent said their kid was home napping, fine, maybe there was an explanation. But if every parent she called said, "I dropped my son off there this morning," then these weren't old bags gathering dust. They were evidence, and they were fresh. Music from somewhere that doesn't exist. While Landon worked through the backpacks, everyone around her kept adding fuel instead of putting it out. Chrissy hovering nearby. Carla growing visibly tense. Information seeming to move between the adults in ways the officers on scene couldn't fully track. Nobody was doing the one thing that would have ended all of this in about 90 seconds, just showing the officer where the kids actually were. Instead, everyone seemed focused on managing what Landon might find next. That's not what an innocent daycare owner does. A cooperative one says, "They're right here, come look." This was the opposite of that. The bags were hidden, the explanations kept shifting. And now, Landon started hearing something new. Music, kids' music, coming from somewhere below her. She went looking for a basement. Carla told her flatly there wasn't one. On its own, a denial like that could be nothing. Plenty of houses don't have basements. But Landon could hear something, and it wasn't coming from any room she'd already been in. She moved through the house trying to place the sound. Was there a lower level she hadn't found? A crawl space? Some kind of hidden access point? A room tucked behind another room? She asked again. Carla said it again. No basement, no downstairs, no hidden anything. The kids, she said now, were at the park, which of course raised its own pile of questions. Which park? Who took them there? If that was true the whole time, Why hadn't it been the very first thing out of her mouth? And if the kids really were at a park somewhere, why were their backpacks stuffed under a blanket in the shower? And why was there music playing under the floor of a building with, apparently, no floor to be under? Landon called her Sergeant. She told him she had a bad feeling about this one. That phrase sounds almost too casual for what was happening. But by this point it wasn't a hunch. It was the weight of 5 or 6 contradictions stacked on top of each other, all pointing the same direction. Stay with this next part, because the story is about to get a lot stranger than a locked door. Right after officers mentioned out loud that they could hear the music, it stopped. Not faded out. Stopped, like someone had reached over and hit a button the second they realized they'd been heard. Now the question wasn't just, where are the kids? It was, does someone down there know we're looking for them? The house that wouldn't stop talking. Here's what makes this case different from the version that almost happened, the version where an officer accepts the surface answer and drives away. Carla said no kids were there. Carla said there was no basement. Carla said everyone was at a park. And every single time, something in that house disagreed with her out loud. Officer Parker, working alongside Landon, started pressing harder. If there's no basement, where's the music coming from? How do we get downstairs? Where, specifically, are the children right now? Carla's answers didn't change. She didn't hear music. There wasn't a basement. The kids were at the park. But the park was starting to sound less like a location and more like a wall she was hiding behind. Because if it were true, there'd be nothing easier than naming the exact park, naming who was watching them, and picking up a phone to have them brought back in 10 minutes. Instead, hidden bags, denied sounds, and a woman who kept drifting around the space in a way that read less like grief and more like management. Officers noticed structural details that didn't add up either. A low window where there shouldn't have been a visible room if this house genuinely had no basement, blinds hung in a spot that made no sense for a crawl space, what looked like possible access somewhere near the deck. Piece by piece, the property itself was starting to tell on her. And then came a sound that erased whatever doubt was left. A child crying, not music, not a TV left on in another room, not something officers could talk themselves out of. Parker heard it. Landon heard it, and the entire tone of the search changed in that instant, because this wasn't about finding evidence to support a case anymore. This was about finding a way to physically reach a child who sounded frightened, hidden, and unable to get out on his own. Parker turned to Carla and told her straight. This had started small, but it was about to get a lot bigger, unless she told them, right now, how to get into that basement. Carla still said there wasn't one. She said she was sorry. She said she didn't know why they were hearing music. An apology doesn't open a hidden door. And by this point, nobody was waiting around for Carla to decide to become honest. The false wall Landon kept searching under the deck, along the side of the house, near what might have been a lower window. Every minute that passed was maddening, because the crying sounded close, but there was no obvious way in. Carla and the other adults knew this house inside and out. The officers didn't. That gap gave the people hiding something a real advantage. They could run out the clock with half answers, deny access points, point everyone toward a park that didn't exist in this story, and generally make the search as confusing as possible. But the officers had something stronger than anyone's word for it. They had the sound of the music, the pile of backpacks, a mother standing in the driveway, a child crying from somewhere that supposedly didn't exist. And they had a flat refusal to let a lie sit there just because it kept getting repeated. It was Officer Parker who finally found it. Court documents would later lay out exactly how it happened, and it's a detail worth knowing, because it's the moment the entire case turned. An officer brushed against a section of wall, and it moved. Not the way a solid wall moves, the way a panel moves when it's built to swing. He looked down and saw 2 parallel scrape marks worn into the wood floor, tracking away from the wall like something had been dragged across it, over and over, for a long time. He moved a potted plant out of the way and found a thin seam running along the edge, a seam that had no business being there if this was just a wall. He pulled it. It slid open. Behind it, a stairwell, leading down. To the basement Carla had insisted over and over, did not exist. What was behind the wall? The officers moved toward the opening, and the smell hit before anything else did. The thick, unmistakable smell of soiled diapers packed into a closed space. The kind of smell that tells you, before you even see anything, that small children have been kept somewhere for far longer than they should have been. Then they saw it. Not one child, not a handful. A basement full of them. Babies and toddlers, 25 of them, packed into a space beneath a house that a woman standing upstairs had sworn, again and again, did not have a basement at all. The daycare with no children had been full of them the entire time. 25 kids, at a location licensed to care for a maximum of 6, and of those 6, only 2 were allowed to be under the age of 2. Investigators would later determine that 12 of the children found in that basement were under 2 years old. Not 2 out of 6. 12 in a space licensed for 2. That gap between licensed for 6 and found with 25 is the difference between a paperwork violation and something that required planning. 1 extra kid on a chaotic day is a mistake. 25 children hidden behind a wall that scrapes open on a track. In a basement a licensed operator repeatedly denied existed, while police and licensing officials searched the floor above them. That's not chaos. That's a system built to hide exactly this. Officers on scene noted that many of the kids down there were sweaty, thirsty, and sitting in soiled or wet diapers. Some were crying. Some likely were too young to fully understand what was happening around them, only that the room was crowded, the lights had been off, and the adults nearby were tense. A woman was down there with them. Her name was Caitlin Nelson. What a parent saw when she walked down those stairs, officers weren't the only ones who eventually stood in that basement. As parents began arriving to collect their children, at least one mother was walked down those same stairs by an officer and a caseworker, and what she described afterward is worth hearing in her own words, because it captures something a police report never quite can. She would later write that she'd been one of the first 2 parents on scene, and that she never would have believed the condition of the place if she hadn't seen it herself. Up until that day, her entire experience with Play Mountain Place had been dropping her child off in what looked like a clean, warm, well-run environment. That afternoon, she was led into a small, dim room she'd never known existed, packed with 26 children surrounded by empty juice boxes, graham cracker crumbs, and a tangle of blankets and stuffed animals. The room smelled of diapers that hadn't been changed in a long time, and several kids around her were crying. She'd hoped at first that this was some kind of one-time emergency. Then she noticed the cubbies lined up in the corner, each one labeled with a child's name, stocked with diapers, including her own kids. Cubbies don't get built and labeled for a single bad afternoon. They get built for routine. Another parent who was shown the basement that day described 4 identical high chairs lined up in a row at the bottom of the stairs, a detail that, on its own, tells you this room wasn't improvised in a panic an hour earlier. It had clearly been used, and used often, long before Officer Landon ever knocked on that door. "I was babysitting," Landon confronted her immediately. "Who are you? Why are these kids down here, hidden in the dark?" Caitlin's answer was that she'd been babysitting. That explanation might work if you strip away every other fact of the afternoon. It does not work once you remember that police had spent the better part of an hour knocking, calling out, and asking exactly where the children were, while Caitlin sat in a basement with 25 of them and said nothing. Landon came to believe, based on everything she'd seen and heard that day, that Carla had gotten word to whoever was downstairs to keep the kids quiet. That's worth framing carefully as the working theory investigators developed, not a confirmed fact on its own, but it lines up with everything else. The music that cut off the second officers mentioned hearing it, the silence that held until a single cry broke through, the repeated denial of a basement that turned out to be sitting directly beneath the room where that denial was happening. At that point, Landon had to manage more than her own reaction to what she was looking at. She had to control the scene, get the kids somewhere safe, separate the adults from each other, start identifying every single child, matching every backpack and every scrap of paper to a phone number, because each one of those numbers belonged to a parent out there somewhere who had no idea what had just been found. Carla tried to insert herself back into it, offering to help call parents, offering to have the other women help care for the kids, positioning herself as part of the solution now that the problem had been dragged into daylight. Landon wasn't handing the scene back to the people who'd just spent the last hour hiding it from her. If the only issue here had been too many kids, that alone would have been serious enough. But this had gone miles past a head count. Carla hadn't been honest. The children had been physically concealed behind a wall built to open and close. Backpacks had been buried under blankets. A basement had been denied to a police officer's face repeatedly, while children cried beneath her feet. Officers had been actively obstructed. Carla, at some point, acknowledged in general terms that she'd done something wrong. That admission didn't undo any of it. The real question now wasn't how many kids had been found. It was how something like this had ever been allowed to become a routine enough occurrence that a hidden basement even existed in the first place. Not the first time. Because here's the part that makes this worse, and it didn't come out until later, in testimony and in reporting that followed the arrests. This wasn't a one-time panic response to police showing up unannounced. One of Carla's employees, Valerie Fresquez, later testified that being sent downstairs with the kids wasn't a completely unheard-of occurrence. She said it wasn't a regular, everyday thing, but it happened sometimes, including, she said, when Carla was giving a tour to prospective new parents. Bring the kids down, keep them quiet. Let the tour happen upstairs without a room full of children giving away how crowded the place actually was. Sit with that for a second. A hidden room used not just to dodge a police welfare check, but potentially to hide the daycare's real numbers from the very parents deciding whether to trust their kid to this place at all. And here's the part that turns this from one bad decision into a pattern spanning 3 decades. Because Colorado wasn't the first time Carla Faith had been caught running a daycare like this. It wasn't even the second. This had happened before, in a different state, under a different name. Long before Play Mountain Place, Carla Faith ran a daycare business out of Culver City, California, called Faith Family Daycare. And according to later reporting, the same complaint kept surfacing there that would eventually surface in Colorado. Too many children, packed into too little space, under too few adults. In 1991, investigators found her at a local park supervising 23 children. Her legal capacity at the time allowed for 14. She was placed on 5 years of probation. She kept operating. In 1998, investigators raided one of her California daycare homes and found 44 small children inside, a facility that, according to reporting, wasn't even licensed. And in one especially telling moment from that period, officers who raided one of her centers reportedly caught employees rushing 31 children down a nearby alley, trying to move them out of sight before anyone could get an accurate count. Sound familiar? When asked about running over capacity, Faith didn't really deny it. She said, more or less, that yes, she occasionally went over, and suggested investigators simply didn't like her, because she didn't always follow their rules. Her California operations were eventually shut down, and rather than stop running daycares, she picked up and moved to Colorado. Here's the detail that should make every parent watching this a little angrier. When Faith applied for a childcare license in Colorado, she wasn't required to disclose any of that history. A spokesperson for Colorado's Department of Human Services later confirmed that applicants don't have to report previous licenses or previous violations or previous shutdowns from other states. There's no question on the form, no box to check. A woman with a documented decades-long pattern of hiding children from inspectors in one state could walk into another state and start over with a clean file. That's not a Carla Faith problem. That's a hole in the system big enough to drive a moving truck through, and it's one of the more uncomfortable lessons buried inside this entire case. And it wasn't just Play Mountain Place in Colorado either. Faith also ran a second facility a few blocks away called Counterpoint School, a much larger operation, licensed to care for as many as 122 preschool-age children. The day after Play Mountain Place was raided, parents got a call telling them to come get their kids immediately. Counterpoint was closing too, swept up in the same investigation. Records would later show that state licensing officials had actually tried to inspect Faith's property just 2 months earlier in September, acting on a prior complaint. Faith refused to let them into 2 additional buildings and a storage shed on the property, telling the inspector they were separate rental units she didn't have keys for. The inspection ended there. Nobody forced the issue. 2 months later, one of those buildings turned out to be sitting on top of the basement where 25 children would be found hidden behind a wall. Landon's persistence is the reason any of this came to light at all. She didn't crack the case because Carla broke down and confessed. She cracked it because she refused to let a single contradiction sit unanswered. A parent said her child was there, so where was he? Backpacks were hidden, whose were they? Music played from somewhere below. Where was that room? Carla denied a basement, so why did the house sound like it had one? A child cried, so how do we reach him? Every lie bought maybe 5 more minutes, and every one of those 5 minutes pushed the search closer to that wall. The place everyone swore was wonderful. Here's what makes this case sit so uneasily with people who hear it. Almost nobody who trusted Carla Faith saw any of this coming. A staff member from Counterpoint School, the larger of Faith's 2 facilities, later described Faith as personable and caring, someone who rarely even set foot in the classrooms and mostly handled billing from a distance. Her own classroom, she said, never held more than about 20 kids with 2 teachers present, well within reason. It never felt chaotic. She'd toured plenty of daycares in her career, and most of them were, in her word, gross. This one wasn't. It was calm, clean, the kind of place you'd feel good about. One mother described watching her son grow attached enough to his teachers at Play Mountain Place that he'd tell them he loved them on his way out the door and would talk about them fondly over the weekend. She credited the daycare with helping him work through a real fear of being separated from her. In hindsight, she remembered him growing unusually clingy in the days right before the raid, crying on the way to drop-off in a way he hadn't before. At the time, she had no way to know why. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire story. A facility can look completely normal from where a parent stands, warm. Teachers, a clean lobby, a kid who seems happy enough at pickup, while something else is happening in a part of the building that parent is never shown. Faith didn't get away with this for years by seeming obviously dangerous. She got away with it by seeming exactly like what parents were hoping to find. The phone calls. Once the kids were pulled out of that basement, the next job was contacting every single parent, which sounds procedural until you actually picture it. A name, a number, a backpack matched to a face. And behind every one of those calls was a parent who had done something completely ordinary that morning, packed a bag, buckled a car seat, kissed their kid goodbye, and gone to work assuming the day would be unremarkable. Then the phone rang. Police were at the daycare. The business was being shut down on the spot. Come get your child. And the reason, when they finally heard it, must have been almost impossible to process in real time. Their kid had been found hidden in a basement behind a wall built to look like it wasn't there. For those parents, that call opened up a flood of questions that don't have easy answers. Was my daughter crying down there? How long was she in the dark? Had this happened before, on some other ordinary Tuesday I never found out about? Was anyone even holding her if she was scared? Those questions don't end the moment a kid is handed back to their parent in a parking lot. They follow families home. By the time this case reached a courtroom nearly 2 years later, some of those families were ready to describe exactly what came home with their kids that day. What the courtroom heard. In August 2021, a jury in Colorado Springs found Carla Faith guilty on 26 counts of misdemeanor child abuse. 1 felony count of attempting to influence a public servant, a count of obstructing a peace officer, and running a child care facility without a proper license. Christina Swager, the just a friend from that first afternoon, was convicted right alongside her on the same set of charges. El Paso County District Attorney Michael Allen said afterward that the verdict delivered something like justice on behalf of every parent this case had touched. But the part of this that's hardest to sit through isn't the verdict. It's the sentencing hearing that followed 2 months later, in October 2021. Prosecutor Andrew Herlihy played the court a video, nearly an hour long, built from statements by parents and by a medical professional describing what these kids had actually carried out of that basement with them. One mother, visibly crying as she spoke, said her child had become noticeably more aggressive since their time at Play Mountain Place, hitting, pulling hair, reacting in ways that hadn't shown up before. Another parent, Kim Marshall, told the courtroom that both of her children were still in counseling, months and months later. "We sleep with the lights on in our house," she said. Her kids, she said, were anxious, afraid of the world in a way small children shouldn't have any reason to be. A child psychologist, Dr. Stephen Berkowitz, also appeared on that video. His assessment was blunt. Experiences like the ones these children had at that daycare can leave long-term impacts, and the kids involved were at elevated risk for emotional, psychiatric, and even medical problems well into their futures. There were no injuries in the medical sense. Every charge was for child abuse without injury. But this case is a pretty clear reminder that without injury doesn't mean without harm. A toddler doesn't need a bruise to be traumatized. A baby can cry in the dark behind a false wall and have absolutely no way, years later, to explain in words what that felt like, only to carry it in the form of nightmares or a fear of the dark or flinching at things that shouldn't be scary anymore. Faith's defense attorney, Josh Tellini, offered a different frame. He argued his client struggled to tell parents no when they wanted a spot for their kid, and that the situation had simply snowballed past her control. He called her decisions incredibly poor, his words, but pushed back on the idea that any of this had been planned as cruelty. Judge Gregory Werner wasn't moved by that framing. Handing down the sentence, he told Faith plainly that what she'd done was wrong on multiple levels, that this wasn't an accident, and it wasn't the product of one bad moment. It was, he said, a series of choices that had put the safety and welfare of 26 children at risk. Where everyone ended up, Carla Marie Faith was sentenced to 6 years in prison for attempting to influence a public servant, along with concurrent 10-month sentences for each of the 26 child abuse counts and for obstructing a peace officer. She was also fined for operating a child care facility without a license. Christina Swager, just a friend, was convicted on the same set of charges as Faith, 26 counts of child abuse, attempting to influence a public servant, and obstructing a peace officer. She received a sentence of 2.5 years, with an additional period of parole to follow. It's worth remembering how this all started for her. Body camera footage played at trial showed her telling an officer as a child was being picked up nearby that she didn't work there at all, just a friend stopping by. That single lie became the backbone of a felony charge. Caitlin Nelson, the woman found in the basement itself, with all 25 children, pleaded guilty to the same 26 counts of child abuse, plus a felony charge for drug possession. She had a prior record and an active warrant at the time she was found underneath that house, which raises its own uncomfortable question: how does someone with that background end up alone with 24 toddlers in a hidden room? Valerie Fresques, another employee, took a plea deal that required her to testify against her former co-workers, testimony that included the detail about being sent downstairs during tours for new parents. She completed a deferred sentence which allowed her guilty plea to be withdrawn and her charges ultimately dismissed. Reporting at the time also noted a warrant had been issued for a third former employee who simply never showed up to court. Different people, different levels of involvement, different outcomes in front of a judge. But together, what they add up to is a child care operation that had quietly stopped functioning on honesty long before Officer Landon ever pulled into that driveway. The lesson underneath all of it: daycare trust works because parents can't be in two places at once. You can't personally supervise your kid's afternoon and also be at your job. So the whole system runs on things you can't verify yourself: a license number, an inspection report, a caregiver's word, a background check filed away somewhere you'll never see it. Most parents don't drop their kid off because they'd rather someone else raise them. They do it because life demands it. A job demands it. Rent demands it. And that need is exactly what makes a betrayal like this one land so hard. It's not just a rule that got broken. It's the entire foundation that makes childcare possible in the first place. There's a question worth sitting with here, and it's the one no parent ever wants to actually ask out loud. What happens in the version of this story where the officer accepts the first answer? Where the backpacks stay hidden under that blanket? Where the music fades and nobody mentions hearing it, so nobody notices it stop? Where the one cry gets missed? That version of this story exists. It just didn't happen, because one officer kept asking the question that everyone inside that daycare should have been able to answer the second she walked up. "Where are the kids?" Carla answered with a denial. The backpacks answered with evidence. The music answered from somewhere below the floor. The crying answered with urgency nobody could argue with, and in the end, it was a scrape mark on a wood floor and a seam behind a potted plant that answered loudest of all. For the parents who lived through this, trust doesn't mean quite the same thing anymore. For the kids, it's a memory sitting somewhere they can't fully reach yet, one that may surface as a fear of the dark or a flinch at a closed door long after they've forgotten the specific afternoon it came from. And for the rest of us, the case leaves something worth holding on to. When something involving kids doesn't add up, keep asking. Don't stop at the first answer just because it's convenient. Because sometimes the truth isn't in the room someone's willing to show you. Sometimes it's built into the wall right next to you, and all it takes to find it is refusing to stop looking.